Hi, I am Jessica Ardeal with Lynn Misch and here to invite you to own your healthcare. Welcome. Hello. Thanks for joining us. If you've been following along, awesome. If this is your first time meeting us, hi, thanks for being here. And Lynn, would you like to dive into any particular pool of thought today?
You know, and I want to say hi to everybody, and just that this is not a replacement for your medical provider. That it's also, in addition to, it's different ideas that we're generating, but it's not a replacement. If you do have a medical problem, please make sure that you're contacting your medical provider and getting the appropriate treatments, because this is not a replacement for that, but it's in addition to. So hopefully we'll give you some good, maybe sage advice and wisdom that will help you along your way and give you a positive outcome in everything that's happening in your world. It was interesting because I know that we've kicked around ideas for years, and as I'm looking at these lovely mountains in the background, and this was a delightful trip that I'd done a few years back, and I was thinking about, you know, where would you want to live and all that kind of stuff. And one of the most important things is that, we where you want to live, externally, but where we live internally, that we have this piece of real estate, right, that we're living in. And I think that it's really important to honor this piece of real estate, in uh, in owning your healthcare, but to acknowledge that we have probably a very valuable commodity that we walk around it all the time, right? And I always say to students, I always say, or to patients, um, you don't realize how important it is until, and how much it does for you until something breaks, right? And what you can do to influence it so that you can support it. And it's really understanding what is happening in this valuable commodity that you're walking around in. So I think that's some of the topic that I probably would like to talk about a little bit today. I don't know if that's where we have to stay, but I think it's really looking at the value in what we have, the ownership in our own healthcare, because we're investing in ourselves, right?
I'm starting to think of those different approaches. Like some people are approaching the body as well. I'm just renting this, right? This is just temporary, and I'm gonna do what I want and live my life, and my body will take care of the rest. And that's one mentality. And if you're approaching your body as if you're owning it, you might be a little more invested to take more time to work on it and present it in a way that feels good to you. Which means sometimes making different sacrifices too, right? And giving up things that you might really enjoy. So bad habits aside, can we keep bad habits going and still be healthy? Like, honestly, that's going to be defined by you, right? How you define your healthcare is really all that matters, because that's how it's going to play out from there once you set that definition. So how do you define healthcare? How do you define healthcare, Lynn?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting comment that you just made, because it's like renting the body or owning the body. And the other piece of it is that there's a lot of controversy about how you wonder how somebody that can live in their 90s and have smoked cigarettes and drank alcohol and did all of that their whole life, and how did they live to be 96? What's the secret ingredient in all of that? And I don't know if we really have that secret ingredient, right? What sustains us. I think that it's how we view the world. A lot of times, I know that with my own healthcare, I've met some really interesting challenges along the way. And sometimes it's maybe moving too fast through things or not paying attention to the world around me that's created some events in my life that were a little bit challenging. And some of it is just happens by chance. But I think that I have really learned in the last, probably, especially 10 years, I've really focused on really looking at, like, when I get particularly, my mood changes, and I get into a space where I might be a little bit darker, that I really have worked now to really flip that switch to turn the light on, to have a more positive outlook than a negative outlook. And I think that that's a pattern of behavior that changes as we embrace and start to understand that there's a whole process that occurs chemically in our body, that when we start to go down a certain pathway, that there's a series of chemicals that are released in our body that really become cause and effect, right? That create a change in what's happening in the outcome that we have, depression being one of those, right? That we're not getting enough. And I always say I was a long distance runner for over 30 years, and I probably a cardiovascular athlete, swam, biked, did all kinds of things, skated. I really grew up in that kind of world, playing baseball, doing all kinds of stuff. But and it was interesting because I think that I didn't realize as I studied running, and it really was a pattern of behavior, that I was, what they said is after a certain amount of time, usually after about 20 minutes to half an hour, that you start to release endorphins, right? And endorphins are those feel good chemicals. And I realized that I was kind of, they call you an endorphin junkie, right? That you become an endorphin junkie because you're doing this behavior because it's releasing certain chemicals to help you to feel better, you know? And when you
I
look at
always
the,
say I work out for my mental health. That's, yeah.
yeah, well, that I think that's the important thing. The other thing that's really interesting is when I worked in a cardiovascular unit, which I never knew, I found this out years ago, and I'd have a really stressful day because it was a high energy, high intensity, critical care units where you're literally, as I coined the phrase, in a heartbeat, things can change, right? You can lose somebody in a heartbeat. And I always say after a 12-hour shift, I'd head right over to Kentucky Fried Chicken. Right? I couldn't figure out why. And what I found out years later was that that fat that I was ingesting, which wasn't probably always the best thing for me, but that fat that I was ingesting also releases endorphins. And so it was almost like you start to move toward these things inherently not knowing why, right? So it's
Right.
interesting when you start to understand those patterns of behavior and the reasons behind them as you read, I tend to read a lot of research and tend to study a lot. And the research is evolving and changing, in the world of our bodies and how we look at disease and those kinds of things. And it's even looking at genetics. When we start to look at genetics and we start to look at, which is interesting because you start to look at genetics, which is how, where your cells came from. So you can look at historically, right, your family genes and how you were created. And then you can start to look at disease processes and genetics and how those, you may have a higher predisposition toward disease processes because of your genetics, right? Your predisposition. It's like with breast cancer patients, they'll look at women and men, because men can have breast cancer. And the higher ratio, it's not as high for men, but it's still there. But the interesting thing is they'll look at genes, they'll look at BRCA. And basically what they're looking at is that, and they're looking at a lot of genotherapy now with cancers because they're looking at that tracing. They actually have geneticists working usually on in systems now because they look at the tracings of how that gene may be in the body and how it can predispose someone to the disease process, right? So I think it's interesting. It's like Angela Jolie, right? An actress. And we'd always talk to breast cancer patients about Angela Jolie and how she went through, she had BRCA1. There's two BRCAs, BRCA1, BRCA2. And BRCA1, she eventually had her children. She had 3 biological children. She adopted 3 and then had 3 of her own. And then she had her breasts removed and her ovaries removed prophylactically because she was reducing her potential risk for breast cancer because her mother died from cancer because she had that BRCA gene. So it's interesting when you start to look at those connections in the family and where you come from and understanding the genome and understanding that there's a ton of research coming down the pike in relation to that, but back to the endorphins and even depression. Depression's another one that there's a strong genetic link to depression. And a lot of times your addictive behaviors or your patterns of behaviors, which is what running became for me. I had to figure out after a period of time that I was really addicted to running, and running was controlling my life. I was not controlling it, it was controlling me. And until I really started to understand that even though this was a supposedly good behavior, positive behavior, that if it was overused, right, it was not necessarily the best thing. So you can overuse something thinking that it's a really good behavior and it may not be. You can take it to the extreme. And I think a lot of it is that the relationship, understanding that there's a relationship and a direct component. Now, I've got addictions in my family, I've got alcoholism in my family, grandfather and aunt, and different on both sides of the family. And so there's a genetic link to, and I think that basically what it was about is that there's a link to depression. They find that oftentimes what's happening is that when people are depressed, they tend to self-medicate, right? And so they'll start to drink or they'll use drugs or whatever it is. And it may start very simply and it becomes a pattern of behavior. And that's the intriguing thing about it, is that we develop these patterns of behavior and it's establishing, do I really want to keep that pattern of behavior in my life or not? So anyway, what do you think, Jess?
I have so many thoughts, I probably won't get many out. Um, that's so much, Lynn. That's just a whole encyclopedia kit together. I'm going all sorts of places, not sure where it's gonna land.
She's circling the airstrip right now, so we've got to bring her in for a landing. Let's see where she lands. We'll give her the opportunity. She's circling and circling. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's okay. Just think, just shoot something out there.
I really, I'm sure I'm not going to right now. This is, yeah, there's a lot there, Lynn. Maybe we'll just leave it there and let, and we'll pick up later.
Well,
Or,
the other thing I'll share with you, and one of the things that I've really come to formulate, is I think that addictive behaviors, one of the connections that I found that I think is really significant is oftentimes those patterns of behavior that develop, and they develop from the time we're little, right? I mean, we're walking around this human experience. We encounter different aspects of experiences, right? And we all interpret the experiences differently. That's the intriguing thing about it, is that you can put kids in the same family, they can have the same exposure to different experiences, and they're all going to interpret the experience differently, right? They're not going to have the same interpretation of whatever happened in a moment in a family exchange, which is a million things in the course of raising a family, having a family, and um, in having a whole whatever it is, plethora of experience. And I think that what I boiled some of addictions down to is it's depression. And I think that that's a whole chemical exchange, back to what I was talking about, is that I think that there were moments where I had issues with depression. I do. I think that that was real because of experience that I had in my life, different maybe relationships that I have that weren't successful. And that would tailspin me into a whole depressive episode about, was I good enough? Was I not good? Whatever happened in that experience. And so I had to work through a lot of that. And however I treated that, whatever tool I picked, bad or good, it was basically to self-soothe, right? To really change how I was interpreting that experience. And so a lot of times the tools that we pick are tools because of our self-concept about how we feel about ourselves. And those feelings are really important because it's tapping into those feelings, which I think we will tap into, I think, in these classes, hopefully, if people are willing to share the feelings that you have about your own human experience. And a lot of times patterns of behavior develop again from the time you're a little person.
And when you bring
And
up the genes, Lynn, and I'm taking the heredity class right now, so my brain just starts to swim because I'm starting to consider things that I didn't before, and there's so much information. And I think it's a microcosm of what we're looking at in the world right now. Like there's so much information out there. We only need little bits here and there to really keep us going, right? Um, and I'm not going anywhere with that thought. That's just where where I'm landing today, but still up in air. Go ahead.
so, yeah, I think it's in it. Well, and back to those patterns, it's like when they look at and the patterns of behavior that have developed. And I think a lot of times when I look at people that have addictions, what happens is that it's about their self-esteem. It's about their own self-concept. And that's what I found that I really had to work on a lot in my own world, that when something happened or I felt like I did something wrong or I wasn't good enough, whatever it was, some of how I shifted, what I found was very valuable for me was I started to flip into gratitude. And I started to flip into being grateful and looking at if I started to tailspin into something, I started to learn and to utilize one of the tools that I really linked into was to be grateful. So if I was doing a tailspin, I would flip it around and still do. I'll flip it around and either write it out that I'm grateful for whatever, or I can remember when I was going through a relationship and the relationship really um, tore me apart. It really did. And it was interesting because I can remember I was doing a journal, a gratitude journal at that time when I was going through a split in the relationship, and I can remember I started this journal, and there were days where I could write one word because I was so devastated by the whole circumstances of what happened. And eventually, as I worked my way through the experience, and it really cracked my heart open, I think. And I became a better human being because of the experience. But in the moments of time when I was going through it, it was like I really didn't understand it. I didn't know why I was hurting, or why it happened, or why it blew up, or any of the rationale for why, the whys. And I started to develop a relationship with the whys weren't as important as the relationship that I needed to develop with being grateful for whatever, and that was the piece and that I've carried with me now for probably almost 20 years, is that was a huge monumental shift for me to develop a pattern of behavior where gratitude became fundamental in my changing my direction, my patterns of behavior.
I'm feeling pretty quiet today, Lynn. I don't, I appreciate everything you're sharing and hearing. I always love talking with you, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in and joining us and watching too. And we will be connecting with you again soon. And for the Own Your Healthcare Master class, make sure to get details on that so we can see you there. And so much that you've shared, Lynn. I'll have to come back and watch this and make some notes.
Well, I appreciate it, Justin. I think it's just, I think in living a life, which is what we do, and I think in living a life, and I invite people to come into owning your own health care, because it's something that I've learned. Not only do I provide health care to others, but the intriguing thing about it is that in the provision of health care to others, I've also learned from others, so the sharing in that community that we're hoping to develop, I think is really important because as we share this community of not only ourselves, but the community with those that are joining, it's really interesting what you learn from each other. And so the value in that, I'm so excited because I love the opportunity to share those experiences. So,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
yeah, yeah. So, thanks. We'll see you soon and have a delightful day. And I'm grateful that I'm here with you, Jess. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.